Well, hello and welcome to the second half of our program, Walt Disney of Kansas City. I'm Beth Pike of the State Historical Society of Missouri, and Disney historian Dan Viets joins us for the second part of his talk about Walt Disney's time in Missouri, focusing on his move to Kansas City before Hollywood came calling. Today's webinar is possible due to our donors and members of the State Historical Society, and we thank you for supporting the work we do to preserve and share Missouri history. Now, Dan Viets is the co-author of the book Walt Disney's Missouri, The Roots of a Creative Genius, published by the Kansas City Star and also available in the SHSMO bookstore, which you can order online as well. Dan is also credited by other Disney authors, assisting them in their research, and he has also written numerous articles for magazines and historical organizations. Dan is president of the not-for-profit organization Thank You Walt Disney, Inc., which owns and is preserving and restoring the building in Kansas City, which housed Disney's first professional film studio, Laugh-O-Gram. It is the location where Disney made some of his earliest animated and live-action films, and there's big plans for this historic building and how it can help the artist community of the future. Dan will talk a little bit more about that as well. And we welcome you back, Dan.
Thank you, Beth, very much. Thanks to the State Historical Society of Missouri for allowing me this opportunity to talk to people about Walt Disney. I love sharing the amazing story of Walt Disney's life and work. We ended the previous session at this point, and this picture is Walt Disney about to clobber one of his staff people with a .45 automatic here, while other crew are watching and egging him on. This is actually not a real camera. This photograph was probably staged for a magazine ad to promote the Laugh-O-Gram studio, and it's actually taken on the roof of our building, the building that housed Walt's first professional film studio at 31st and Forest Streets in Kansas City, just about a block east of Troost at 31st. You can see the terracotta trim on the east side of the building and here on the north side of the building. And you can even identify where this was by the irregular pattern of the capstones here in the foreground on the west end of the building. In the previous image, right here, you can see a small megaphone in the hand of the director. And that very same megaphone was exhibited at the Disney 100 exhibit at Union Station, which recently closed, but ran for several months last year and early this year. That artifact is priceless. And of course, in the silent film era, directions were given vocally. There was no concern about sound on a silent film set. This is really an amazing artifact, which was given to the Disney Company's first archivist, David Smith, by the widow of Arthur Verne Cogger, who owned and operated the Kansas City Slide Company, later the Kansas City Film Ad Company, where Walt worked and where Walt really had his first experience making moving pictures. Just before he went to work for just after he went to work for Mr. Cogger, he founded the Laugh-O-Gram studio in the building at 31st and Forest, just discussed. One of the enterprises he operated from that building was taking motion picture film of people on the street and urging them to come down to the ISIS Theater tomorrow night to see themselves on the big screen at the ISIS, which really was a beautiful, large neighborhood theater on Troost near 31st. We have a camera nearly identical to this one, this camera in the rumble seat of this flivver. This is Walt here on the right, and the Laugh-O-Gram film. It's called a universal camera, a hand-cranked, silent, black and white film camera. And again, we have one nearly identical to it, which will be part of our exhibits at the Laugh-O-Gram building when it's fully restored. We're now in the process of doing the restoration of the physical plant at our building. In other words, we have a $2 million grant thanks to the efforts of Congressman Emanuel Cleaver, which is going to allow us to reinstall plumbing and wiring in our building. And we hope get it sealed off from the weather in short order. One of the last films, in fact, the last film that Walt made at the McConahay Building in Kansas City was called Alice's Wonderland, and it became the pilot episode of a series of 54 Alice comedies. Here we see Walt essentially portraying himself, portraying a young, struggling artist and businessman trying to come up with an idea to save his little studio. And this is a share of stock. Walt actually gave out shares of stock in the company in lieu of paying his employees toward the end. The company went bankrupt, so the stock had no value in terms of monetary value in 1923. But today, if you could find this stock certificate, it would be worth a great deal of money, of course. Now, Walt enlisted as his star in the first of the Alice comedies, this little girl, Virginia Davis. Virginia's mom was clearly a stage mother. She would wrap Virginia's hair up in rags each night to make it curl, as you see it here. She somewhat resembled Mary Pickford in that respect. And the Alice comedies were certainly influenced by the Our Gang comedies and what later became known as the Little Rascals comedies. They would start out in a live action setting, but then Virginia would either get conked on the head or would fall asleep and start dreaming, or in one episode she inhales laughing gas, but she goes off to cartoon land. Here we see she's gotten in some sort of mischief and seems to be placed under arrest because of it. But here we see an image that resembles what the cartoons actually looked like. Virginia remained a live action character in these films, and she interacted with an animated world around her and animated characters around her. You can see the cat character here climbing on the back of the giraffe. This cat was known as Julius the cat, and Julius showed up in several of the early Laugh-O-Gram cartoons. And Julius, in turn, was clearly heavily influenced by a very popular animated character, Felix the cat, and also by Crazy Cat. So cats were popular cartoon animals at that time. There were certainly mice, as you can see in the upper right here. There were certainly mice in the early Laugh-O-Gram cartoons, but not Mickey. There were mice who perhaps were the progenitors of Mickey, but Mickey as such did not appear until a few years later. However, as we discussed previously, Walt said in several major magazine interviews that his creation of Mickey was inspired by a pet mouse that he kept in his studio at Laugh-O-Gram. Here we see again Alice interacting with some of the animated cartoon characters. Now, Alice had been, among other things, I say Alice, but I mean Virginia Davis, who portrayed Alice, among other things, had portrayed a bird of paradise, and she flew from one end of the Kansas City Convention Hall to the other on New Year's Eve, and that was quite a feat. I mean, for a little girl like that to be suspended way, way up in the air on a trolley system would have certainly discouraged most adults from even attempting such a thing. But Virginia was she was precocious. I think that's an understatement. There she is in later years. Virginia was a great lady, and I was privileged to get to know her personally. We brought her back to Kansas City for a couple of fundraising events back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And she had said she had not been back to Kansas City since her family left in 1922. She followed Walt Disney to Hollywood, and her parents clearly wanted her to be in the movies, and she was. In fact, after Virginia starred in I think about 14 episodes of the Alice comedies, she was replaced by another little girl. Her mother thought she deserved more money than Walt was paying her, and Virginia had other offers. And in fact, Virginia continued to act, sing, and dance in live action and obviously talking sound pictures. In fact, I believe her last film may have been The Harvey Girls. And The Harvey Girls is a great Technicolor MGM musical, wonderful film, very much worth watching. And in The Harvey Girls, Virginia sings and dances right next to Judy Garland. She was clearly a very talented lady. And because of her work in the very early Walt Disney cartoons and films, on October 16 of 1998, she received the Disney Legend Award. Now, this is in an area at the Walt Disney Studio, not normally open to the public. And this building you see with the seven dwarfs holding up the roof of the building, that was built and designed by Michael Eisner. He's not actually an architect, of course, but he signed off on and approved of the design of this building. And it's very appropriate because indeed it was Snow White, the original, not the recent ill-fated live-action remake, which I'm sorry to say is a pale imitation of the original. But the 1937 color feature-length animated film, the first successful feature-length animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And that film made so much money, it made more money than any other movie had made up to that time, that it allowed Walt to purchase the land in Burbank where the Walt Disney Studio is still located today. So an area in front of the Seven Dwarfs building now is called the Legends Plaza. Each year, the Disney Company awards some of the folks who have made major contributions to the development of the company, actors, directors, writers, people in all areas of film production and theme park production. And again, here we see on the 75th anniversary to the day of the founding of the Walt Disney Company. This is, if you can make out here at the podium, that's Roy E. Disney. His father, Roy O. Disney, was Walt's brother. This is Walt's nephew. At that time, I believe he chaired the board of directors. Here's a little bit better image. Michael Eisner on the left here, Roy E. Disney, and Virginia Davis receiving the Legend Award. So Michael and Roy explained to everyone present what was going on, what I've just told you. I was so privileged and lucky to be able to be present for this thing. You know, I was in Los Angeles. I knew Virginia was going to be getting this award. I called her up the day before and said, "Hey, Virginia, do you need a date for the Legends Award?" And she says, "Well, Dan, I don't have a date, so I guess I do need one." And so she gives me a guy's name and phone number. I call him up, and that's all it took. I say, "I'm Virginia Davis's date." And he says, "Well, your name will be on the list at the front gates. Just drive up and the valet will take your car." And there were only probably no more than 300 people at this event who actually could be seated, and many of them were media press people, of course. So again, Michael Eisner, Roy E. Disney explained the important role that Virginia Davis played in the founding of the Walt Disney Company on the 75th anniversary to the day of the day that Walt signed the contract to make the Alice comedies. She goes up to the podium and she paused, and it seemed like a long pause, and she had everyone's attention there. And she finally says, "Well, it's about time. 75 years ago, I founded this company, and now you're finally getting around to giving me an award for it." And she was hilarious. She was a great comedian, and she gave a great speech that day. Her hands were placed in cement, and her autograph is in cement. Right there at the Legends Plaza today, along with dozens, if not hundreds, of other Disney Company legends. This book by Horatio Alger, Only an Irish Boy, in many ways reflects the way Walt Disney described himself when he left Kansas City late in the summer of 1923, having gone bankrupt at Laugh-O-Gram. He said he had a mismatched suit on and a cardboard suitcase, and he had a couple of pairs of clean underwear in there and one reel of film, that one Alice comedy that he had made in Kansas City. He went down to Union Station and got on the train and took it all the way on the Santa Fe, as they said, to Hollywood. And this postcard shows the route of the Santa Fe, which traces the route of Walt Disney's life. Both the railway and Walt Disney began in Chicago, and then go through Marceline, go through Kansas City, and then all the way again on the Santa Fe to Los Angeles, to Hollywood. Each of these red dots represents one of the Fred Harvey restaurants and hotels along the way. And again, that's where the film title, The Harvey Girls, comes from. The Fred Harvey restaurants were credited with taming the West, with civilizing the West, with introducing a little bit of decorum and good manners to the West. This is just an early image of Union Station. We're so lucky that Union Station has been restored. That was an historic move, a bi-state sales tax that was passed many years back to fund the restoration and the preservation of Union Station. This postcard of Union Station is the crowd that gathered there to witness the groundbreaking for the Liberty Memorial, the tall tower which stands directly opposite the front of Union Station today. And that was said to have been the largest crowd in the history of Kansas City. Walt arranged to be flown in a biplane over the crowd with a film camera and attempted to take footage of the crowd from the airplane. Unfortunately, his experience with doing that type of work was limited, and the film was overexposed. But nonetheless, that was also one of Walt's last-ditch efforts to stay in business in Kansas City. He was what was called a stringer. He was a local associate of some of the national newsreel companies. Some of you who are my age, if any of you are my age, recall that part of the film program, typically back as recently as the 50s and even early 60s, was not only a cartoon before the main feature, but often a newsreel, some sort of recent topical issue or development that was filmed. And before we had television news, we had newsreels at the movie theaters. Well, one of the reasons that Walt chose to move to Los Angeles as opposed to New York, and actually almost all film production at that time was being done in New York and New Jersey, but Walt chose to move to Los Angeles in part because his big brother Roy was in Los Angeles. Roy was recovering from tuberculosis, which he picked up during World War I. And so the Soldiers' Home at Sawtell, the Veterans Administration hospital, I believe, I've been told reliably, still stands there in the suburb of Sawtell. And that's the reason Walt Disney went to Hollywood. No one else was making animated films in Hollywood before Walt Disney went there. The live action film industry had just begun to move to Hollywood, but no one was making animated films before Walt Disney went there. Now, Walt didn't originally plan to make animated films there. He wanted to be a director. And if he couldn't be a director, then he wanted to be an actor. But no one was hiring young boys from Kansas City with no experience to direct their films or even to act in them. Now, Walt may have been an extra in a couple of Westerns back then, but no one knows what they were or whether they were actually released with him on screen or not. But Roy advised him to go back to what he knew how to do. And again, the Walt Disney Company counts its official founding on the day that Walt signed a contract with M.J. Winkler. Margaret Winkler of New York was the nation's foremost distributor of animated films back then. She distributed both Felix the Cat and Crazy Cat cartoons, as well as others. And Margaret Winkler gave Walt a contract for the Alice comedies on the strength of that first one-reeler he made in Kansas City. And so Walt went to see his big brother at the Sawtell Veterans Home. Roy was in bed recuperating. Other veterans were sleeping in their beds in that ward. And Walt comes in waving this letter around and yelling, Roy, we've got a contract. We're in the movie business. And they were. And Roy got up out of that bed and he never went back. He had recovered sufficiently. They both stayed with their Uncle Robert, who had lived in Kansas City earlier. Uncle Robert, their father's brother, Robert Disney, played a big role in giving the boys a place to live. And initially, they actually made cartoons in Uncle Robert's garage, which was in a suburb of Hollywood. And that house, by the way, still stands today. Also, I'm very happy to be able to report that one of Walt's granddaughters, Joanne Miller, acquired Uncle Robert's bungalow. It's a nice arts and crafts style house, and it will now be preserved and saved. Now, this image illustrates a very important point. All of these young men are from Kansas City. All of these young men worked with Walt Disney in Kansas City. And once Walt and his brother Roy got a toehold, they by the way, made this Alice comedy the first one to be released in theaters by themselves. I mean, obviously they had Virginia working with them, but just the two of them made this cartoon, one real cartoon. That's a great deal of work for two guys to undertake. But it was successful, and it was the first of a successful series. Um, and so as Walt got a toehold, he began to bring out to Hollywood some of the young men who had worked with him in Kansas City. The very first one was Ub Iwerks here. Ub was very important to Walt's career. They had met right after Walt returned from his service in the Red Cross after World War I, went to work for the Pesman Rubin Advertising Company in Kansas City, and that's where he met this guy, Ub Iwerks. Ub was just about the same age as Walt, but he had a very different personality. He was very quiet, reserved, withdrawn, whereas Walt was outgoing, gregarious, and a promoter. But the two of them got along well. Two of them managed to complement each other. And Ub was, by all accounts, one of the greatest artists, certainly probably the greatest animator of the 1920s. Not only was Ub Iwerks an extremely talented artist and animator, but he also later won Oscars for his innovations in camera design and special effects design, in particular on the film Mary Poppins. So Walt and Ub Iwerks worked together, except for a brief period when Ub went off to try to found his own film company. They worked together for many decades. Now, the other gentleman behind Walt here, on the left side, that's George Walker, Ub Iwerks, um, uh, Hugh Harmon, Rudy Ising, Friz Freeling. Isidore is actually his real name, but he's often credited in the later Warner Brothers cartoons as Friz, F-R-I-Z, Friz Freeling, and Roy Disney, of course, there on the right-hand side. Walt Disney's kneeling in front, and this is one of the other little girls. That's not Virginia, of course, but one of the other little girls who was cast as Virginia after she left the series. Now, this is an image which shows how Mickey evolved from an earlier character. On the left is Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Now, after the Virginia comedies ran their course, and again, there were, I believe, 54 episodes of the Virginia comedies, the Alice comedies, rather, made, uh, Walt got a contract with Universal Pictures. Each of the studios had a continuing character, a continuing series of cartoons back then. Universal wanted a rabbit character, and so Walt, working, of course, with Ub and other of his crew, came up with this image of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. And Walt made Oswald cartoons for about a year and went out to New York to meet with Mrs. Winkler's new husband, Charles Mintz, and had a rude reception from Mr. Mintz, who informed him that he should have read his contract. He should have hired a lawyer. He should have read his contract closer, because under that contract, Mr. Charles Mintz owned the rights to the character Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Mr. Mintz had gone behind Walt's back and hired away all of his crew except for Ub Iwerks. Ub stayed loyal when all of the other artists agreed to go to work for Mr. Mintz behind Walt's back. And Walt said, of course, we don't know the exact words he used, but Walt told Mr. Mintz that he could keep those artists, and that Walt was not going to come to work for him, as Mr. Mintz seemed to think he would. Walt told him good luck with Oswald, and on the train ride back from New York with his wife Lillian Disney, Walt said on many occasions he came up with the concept of Mickey Mouse. Initially, he wanted to call the character Mortimer Mouse. Lillian did not like the name Mortimer, and so they came up with Mickey as an alternative. But what you can see here by comparing these two images is how little Mickey really changed from Oswald. You give the character round ears instead of rabbit ears, and a long mouse tail instead of a bunny tail, and essentially you have Mickey Mouse. Now, one of the interesting facts about and ties that Walt continued to have to Kansas City was a licensing agreement with Hallmark Cards. And these are just a small sampling the cards that Hallmark licensed. Hallmark used Disney licensed characters. They also made wrapping paper and various other novelty items as well as cards. And today, Hallmark continues that licensing agreement with the Walt Disney Company. It is said to be the longest licensing agreement in the history of the film industry. This is a photograph of Walt and two of his brothers that you don't see that often. Raymond Disney, and that's Herbert Disney on the left. Raymond is in the dark suit. That's their mother, Flora. You don't see Flora smile very often, but this is a nice image of her smiling for a change, and Walt clowning around as usual, pretending to sneeze into his handkerchief here. And I believe that's Roy on the right side there. Now, in 1937, as I mentioned earlier, a true landmark in the history of Disney's life and in the history of the movies came about when on December 31st, if I recall correctly, the film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was released nationwide, and it was an incredible success. Many people were skeptical that audiences would sit still for a feature-length animated film. Many people thought that the film was going to be a disaster, that it was not going to make any money, that it was not going to be entertaining, and nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, it made a ton of money. As I said, more money than any other film had made up to that point in time. And until Gone with the Wind came out just a couple of years later, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was the most lucrative movie ever made. One of the reasons the movie made so much money was because Roy was very astute about licensing. And so on this Time magazine cover from December of 1937, you see Walt at his desk with some of those licensed Seven Dwarfs characters. And the licensing agreements for Snow White resulted in dozens, perhaps hundreds of licensed characters. We still see them today, licensed characters from the 1937 animated feature film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And it is just such a wonderful film. I went to the new live action film recently, and it's interesting. It's technically well done, but it doesn't have the heart. It doesn't have the soul that Snow White does. I urge you to go back and watch the 1937 version of Snow White. It has aged very, very well. It began, by the way, Snow White kicked off what is known as the golden age of Disney animation. And that included the next film that Walt released, the next feature-length animated film that Walt released was Pinocchio, also a very successful film, did not make as much money as Snow White, but it was successful, and it continues to this day to make money for the Walt Disney Company. It continues to be a very watchable film. He also made Bambi in short order, and Fantasia, and finally Dumbo was the fifth of those golden age animated films. Along the way, he made an interesting film, which is a combination of live action interspersed with animation called The Reluctant Dragon. And what's interesting about The Reluctant Dragon is that it gives you an opportunity to see the studio. It's actually filmed on the grounds and inside the buildings on the Walt Disney Burbank studio lot. Well, just before Dumbo was to be released, very early in 1942, Walt came back to Kansas City. And he came back to Kansas City and Marceline on many occasions. But in particular, he came back to Kansas City just before Dumbo was released. So, of course, this banner was hung for that occasion. And he's meeting here with some of his old friends at the South Central Business Association. The SCBA was a kind of a chamber of commerce. And he brought with him gifts for his old pals at the SCBA, and those gifts were little hand-painted plaster figurines of the character Dumbo. Well, back when I began this Disney obsession back in the early 90s, the SCBA was actually still around. Its last president was still around. I interviewed him, and he actually had some of these Dumbo figurines from that lunch visit with Walt Disney, and even at that time, at least, in their original shipping container. So we acquired a couple of those, and they'll be part of our collection, part of our exhibits at the Laugh-O-Gram Museum. That evening, you can see Friday, February 13, 1942, that evening, Walt Disney went to a reunion at Benton School, his grade school on Benton Boulevard. And that building still stands, by the way. The building has been transformed into condominiums. In fact, it was a Columbia, Missouri developer who accomplished that. And this artifact is in the collection of the Kansas City Public Library in the Missouri Valley Room. So as it says here, this is Walt's autograph. That was kind of unnecessary to to write that on here, but it also is the autograph of his principal, J.M. Cunningham. And J.M. Cunningham was the one who took him around to all the classes at Benton School to do his Abraham Lincoln act back in the mid-teens. And Daisy Beck Fellers was said to be Walt's favorite school teacher. She was also the track coach there, and Walt was active in track. Now, Dumbo was scheduled to be on the cover of Time magazine, but Dumbo was bumped off of Time magazine when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. Walt, a couple of years later, learned that his old boss at the Kansas City Slide Company, Mr. Arthur Byrne Cogger, was going to be visiting Los Angeles. And Mr. Cogger's daughter was married to a serviceman who was stationed out in Los Angeles. And so Walt wrote back to Arthur Cogger, and he addresses him, "Dear Boss." He says, "Dear Boss, it was swell to get your note and to know you're going to be out here for a few days. By all means, I want to have you over to the studio. You know, of course, there's a dinner planned for you on Thursday evening, the 28th. Why not come to Burbank that morning and make a day of it?" And Walt wanted to show off. That's clearly what he wanted to do. He wanted to show his old boss how he had succeeded and what he'd been able to build. Now, there was no Disneyland yet. Disneyland didn't open for another 11 years. But Walt did indeed show off for Mr. Cogger what he had accomplished at that point, what he had built. On the left side here, we see Mr. Cogger's son-in-law. But here is Arthur Byrne Cogger, and here's Iwerks. And the four of them are hoisting one or two drinks that afternoon at the studio. And this is a rare photograph. You will not find images of Walt Disney with either a drink or a cigarette in his hand very often at all. It's also a very rare photograph because this bar was not visible in Walt's office. This bar was hidden behind a false wall. And when certain visitors were there, Walt would slide back the false wall and expose this very well stocked and very well equipped bar. But you will not find images of Walt with a drink or a cigarette, and certainly not with the bar in his office open. You know, when we see Walt's office today, and it's been recreated several times, we're looking through what we would call the fourth wall in a studio or film production, stage or film production. We're looking through the bar, essentially. You still don't see the bar in Walt's office. But here again is a nice picture of Iwerks and Arthur Cogger and Walt Disney. And these figurines, these characters are from the feature-length animated film, The Three Caballeros. Oh, doggone, I used to know these characters' names. Donald Duck, of course, is in Mr. Cogger's hands. And Pancho, and the third character's name escapes me at the moment. But that evening, they did indeed have a dinner to honor Mr. Cogger. You know, you see the Roosevelt Hotel sign every night at the beginning of Jimmy Kimmel's show on ABC, which, of course, is owned by the Walt Disney Company. But you see the Roosevelt Hotel sign from the back, so you see it in reverse. And the Roosevelt is a very historic location on Hollywood Boulevard. A lot of Hollywood history. The Oscars, for instance, took place at the Roosevelt Hotel on at least a few occasions. And so at the Roosevelt Hotel that same evening, many of the animators, the artists, and the other creative people who had worked for Mr. Cogger in Kansas City gathered to honor him at a dinner at the Roosevelt Hotel. And you can pick out a couple of the faces here. Some of them are a little out of focus. Here's a little bit better image in that regard. Here's Frick Freeling again, a few years later than the other photograph. pretty sure that's Iwerks right there. This, of course, Walt Disney. This is Mr. Cogger. Uh, and and let's see here. This is Mrs. Cogger. I believe I'm correct. No, this is Mrs. Cogger right here. And this is one of their daughters, and this is the other daughter. Now, Walt's son, Ted Cogger, who became a good friend of mine, is not in this photograph because Ted Cogger was assigned to guard the home of the leader of the free world during World War II. And I'm not exaggerating. Ted Cogger, Mr. Cogger's son, guarded Hyde Park, the home of Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt and their children. And so Ted Cogger and his wife, his lovely wife, Melba, became very close friends with the Roosevelt family. They celebrated Christmas holidays with during World War II. It's really pretty amazing. There are very few people that have ever walked the earth who could say that they were acquainted with both Walt Disney and Franklin Roosevelt, but Ted Cogger indeed could do that. Someone had the foresight. In fact, it was Joseph Hardaway, also from Kansas City. He had not worked with Walt in Kansas City, but he was an animator from Kansas City. Joseph, whose nickname was Bugs Hardaway, was at this dinner at the Roosevelt Hotel, and he had the foresight to create a scrapbook. He recognized the historic importance of this gathering. This scrapbook actually has a wooden cover, and it's very nicely bound. And it is also now in the hands of the Walt Disney Archive. Here's a self caricature done by Friz Freeling. I hope you remember this face, and not a very flattering self caricature there. But here is an extremely valuable piece of artwork. There are only two known images of Mickey Mouse drawn by Walt Disney. Now, you may see some articles that have been written that say that Walt Disney couldn't even draw Mickey Mouse. Well, that's not true. And we have evidence of that right here. This is just a little sketchy, ripped off in 30 seconds, but a very decent image, a very decent rendering of Walt Disney. And again, the scrapbook went home with Mr. Cogger and his wife to A.B. Cogger, who gave me my start in the movies. And Walt adds his address down there. And they had planned, this group of Kansas Cityans had planned to get together every year after that to celebrate their shared heritage and to meet up with Mr. Cogger. But unfortunately, Mr. Cogger died a few months later. So that was the one and only reunion of the Kansas City artists who had worked with Mr. Cogger in Kansas City and later succeeded in Hollywood. Well, this is an interesting little Disney piece of history connected to MU that I just came across fairly recently. Back in the 50s, they had all kinds of queens. They would have a barn warming queen, and of course they had a homecoming queen, and they had a Savitar queen. The yearbook at MU, of course, is called the Savitar. And they didn't have any drag queens at that time, at any rate, as far as we're aware. But they did hire Walt Disney, not hire, but they invited Walt Disney to judge the Savitar Queen contest. So as you see in the subheadline, Walt was charged with selecting a queen from a field of 7 finalists. And we see the 7 finalists, not the 7 dwarfs, but the 7 queen finalists here in the photograph on the left. And Miss Fraser, apparently they referred to students then by Mr. and Ms. and their last names. But Miss Marilyn Fraser was selected. She was a Pi-Phi, was selected as the Savitar Queen. And according to this article, Walt was going to have a letter in that year's Savitar. Well, of course, I located a copy of that year's Savitar. And unfortunately, there's no letter from Walt Disney in it, but there is a reference to the fact that he judged the Savitar Queen contest. And again, a little more detail here. 500 persons watched as Ms. Marilyn Fraser Pi-Phi was crowned on Saturday night. Well, Walt got his second Time magazine cover, Dumbo having been bumped off by Pearl Harbor. Got his second Time magazine cover in 1955 when Disneyland opened. July 17, 1955 was the opening day of Disneyland. And Walt was a genius at promotion. He knew that by doing a television program for ABC TV he could promote this new theme park, and he needed help from ABC. Walt risked everything he owned to build Disneyland. And, that wasn't the only time he'd done that. Snow White, if Snow White had not succeeded, Walt would have gone out of business. Um, Similarly, if Disneyland had not succeeded, Walt would have gone out of business. He cashed in his life insurance. He liquidated everything he had in order to build that theme park, and he needed ABC's help. He had gone to CBS, he'd gone to NBC, and they said, "Well, we're not in the theme park business. We're not interested." But ABC said, "Well, if you will produce for us a weekly 1 hour program, and if you'll give us a 5 day a week after school program, then we'll invest in your theme park." So ABC initially owned 15% of Disneyland, and Walt produced what became the Wonderful World of Color. But the original title of that weekly television program was Disneyland. And even after the name change, the opening sequence was always Tinkerbell visiting each of the four lands in the theme park. So the television program was definitely conceived as a way to promote Disneyland. And I know I was programmed by watching that show. I really wanted to go to Disneyland. And I can remember the first time I visited California, I went directly to Disneyland. And I think it was the programming from watching The Wonderful World of Color that drove that. But this is a nice cover with a lot of Disney's classic characters on it. And here's some pre-opening art. There were a lot of, again, just as with Snow White, Walt and Roy knew the value of licensing agreements. And they entered into licensing agreements before Disneyland opened and before it was built. And so some of these early toys and other artifacts reflect earlier plans for Disneyland that are somewhat different from the final product. So this is actually a close-up of a portion of a TV tray. TV dinners were big in the 50s, but this was a TV tray, and the close-up shows down here on the lower right that a circus was planned for Disneyland. And this is Main Street, USA, down here. The main entrance to the park is down below the edge of this postcard. Main Street, USA, of course, is based on the main street of Marceline, but the original plan was to have a circus over here. Walt loved circuses. And so there actually was a circus that operated in Disneyland for only the first year of the park's operation. And Walt learned that as much as he loves circuses, and so do lots of people love circuses, that's not the reason they came to Disneyland. People were not really interested in seeing a circus at Disneyland. And so this area now is essentially just a backstage area. It's not open to the general public. There were various plans for this area. It was at one time was going to be called Liberty Square, and another variation on that theme at one time. But it's really never open to the public at all. On the other hand, this is Tomorrowland. As you go up to the main hub of the park, if you go straight ahead, you go to Fantasyland. You go to the left, then you'll go to Frontierland and Adventureland down here, where the the Jungle Land boat ride takes place. But over here on the right was Tomorrowland. And right here you can see a very slender version of the Tomorrowland rocket ship. And the Tomorrowland rocket ship was sponsored by TWA. And TWA was headquartered in Kansas City, Missouri. Howard Hughes had located a headquarters for his airline there. Now, this area up here never came to be. This was going to be kind of a farm-themed park. You can see the barns here, a little white steepled church, and a covered bridge. But that, in a sense, that was recreated outside the berm, outside the theme park itself, but never really was developed. Instead, this area became part of Tomorrowland, and the automobile rides, the Autopia rides, took up a lot of real estate up here, and they still do today. But the centerpiece of Tomorrowland was the rocket ship. And again, you can see the rocket ship in a slightly different version right here. This is a painting that was done and it was shown on the Disneyland TV program. They still think they're going to have a circus here, and they did briefly. You can see again the Jungle Cruise ride right here. and Frontierland. As far as I know, they never actually had a hot air balloon at Disneyland. They may have had it one time, but it was not a regular feature. Holidayland is what kind of grew out of that farm themed area. But Holidayland was never really a farm theme. It was an open area where corporate picnics, for instance, took place and things of that nature. Did not last very long. It's kind of a forgotten feature of Disneyland. Here's Walt in the very first episode of the TV program Disneyland. The rocket ship keeps growing bigger here, and he's pointing out the features. The park has not been built yet. The TV show started about a year before the park was built. Here's a postcard that TWA used. There was a lot of cross promotion between TWA and Disneyland. And of course, TWA was the official airline of Disneyland. And this rocket ship, this is how the rocket ship finally ended up looking. It was 80 feet tall. It was designed by Werner von Braun, the former German World War II German Nazi rocket scientist who was enlisted by the US government to help with the space program and who played a very important role in the early American space program. So von Braun actually had a hand in designing this rocket ship. The idea of the design here is that these legs would fold up into the body of the rocket, and these would become concentric circles when it was actually in flight. And you can see the cockpit up here and the portholes around the rocket ship. And the idea was that in the distant future of 1985, we would all be going to the moon and back routinely on TWA rocket ships. So everyone who took that ride, and by the way, the ride was actually in these circular chambers. You would go inside of a circular chamber, which had concentric rows of, I think, 3 rows of seats around it, and a screen on the floor, a screen on the ceiling. And as the rocket, the whole little ride shook as the rocket blasted off. You could see the blast off on the floor screen. You could see the blue sky turn dark and the stars come out on the ceiling screen. And you would circle the moon. And meanwhile, Captain Collins would be narrating this program. And P.J. Collins signed a certificate for each person that took the ride, certifying that they'd been to the moon and back on the TWA rocket ship. Well, that same year, which was TWA's 30th anniversary, they held what they called the Cosmic Contest. And there were 2 parts to this thing. In 1955, you were supposed to predict, and every passenger that got on a TWA flight was given an entry form. And the first part was predict, or rather explain why air travel is the best way to travel and why TWA is the best airline. And Walt Disney and Willie Lay, a science writer, and Jackie Cochran, a aviatrix pilot, and a couple of other celebrities were the judges, at least theoretically, of the first part of that contest. But the second part was to predict what air travel would be like in the distant future of 1985. And so they couldn't judge that contest for another 30 years. So they microfilmed the entries in the second part of the Cosmic Contest, and they stored those microfilmed entries in the rocket ship. Howard Hughes built a second TWA moonliner and put it on top of his building in downtown Kansas City at 18th and Baltimore. And so there's a little vault. Here's that rocket ship being hoisted up on top of the building at 18th and Baltimore. This was in the summer of 1956. Disneyland had been open for about a year. And this thing was trucked out here from New York. It was built by a sign company who specialized in giant eccentric reproductions of aircraft, the Artcraft Company. It was trucked out to Kansas City and hoisted up on top of the TWA building. And here on the same date, this little apparatus was added on through the cockpit. The cockpit was removed. On the opposite side from the cockpit is a little vault that you wouldn't notice if you weren't looking for it, but I would say roughly 12 by 14 inches. And that's where the microfilmed entries were stored. And originally it was planned that they would be stored there for 30 years. In fact, they were stored there for about 4 years because then TWA, for whatever reason, chose to end its contract with Disneyland. And so they no longer were the sponsors of the Disneyland rocket ship. And so they took their rocket ship off of this building and it was sold to John May, who ran the spacecraft, RV, and camper shell company, which in turn moved to Independence, Missouri, taking the rocket ship with them, and then moved all the way to Concordia, right along I-70. I remember my first visits to Columbia back in 1969, seeing this rocket ship from the interstate and thinking, boy, that's a cool thing. I wish I had a rocket ship like that. Well, uh, little did I know that about 30 years later, I learned that this rocket ship has Disneyland connections. Now, the legging covers had been removed, and obviously the paint scheme had been removed, and it had undergone a lot of rust. But by golly, that was the spitting image of the Disneyland Moonliner rocket ship. And so I approached Mr. May at the right time. He was just getting ready to retire, and he agreed to sell me that rocket ship. And I went to my good friend Don Jordan here in Columbia, who agreed to undertake the restoration work. This is my young friend Max Neenan here, and we are examining the nose cone and the cockpit for the Moonliner here at Don Jordan's workshop. And finally, for the Walt Disney 100th birthday party on September 21 of 2001, the rocket ship was unveiled and had been beautifully and fully restored. I mean, what a beautiful artifact this thing is. And I was so happy to be able to show that off in Marceline for the Marceline Walt Disney 100th birthday party, which unfortunately was scheduled 10 days after 9/11. And so hundreds of people had planned to fly into this Walt Disney 100th birthday party from all around the world, but nobody could fly at that time because 9/11, the bombing, or rather the crashing of the airliners into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and a field in Pennsylvania had occurred 10 days earlier. No airplanes were flying at that time. Meanwhile, we're hauling a missile down the highway, and I was afraid we might draw some attention from satellite surveillance, but we made it okay. The rocket ship, by the way, that I've acquired and that Don Jordan has restored also was originally built with lighting inside the portholes and inside the cockpit, a nice feature. And this, Don had the great idea to use the decals from a plastic model kit of the TWA Moonliner and blow them up, and so we have a perfect reproduction of the actual logo on the TWA Moonliner. Strangely enough, while we're restoring that rocket ship, the Kansas City Moonliner, the Moonliner 2, Disneyland was rehabbing Tomorrowland and was recreating the original Moonliner. The original Moonliner was destroyed after TWA ended their sponsorship and McDonnell Douglas sponsored it for a couple of years. Disneyland did away with the original rocket ship, but they recreated it back in 1998, and this rocket still stands in Disneyland today. Ironically, it's almost exactly the same height as the Kansas City Moonliner, about 30 feet tall, and you can see it was sponsored by Coca-Cola, which fortunately uses the same colors as TWA, red and white. Well, I'm going to have to hurry to finish. There's always more history than there is time to tell it, but this is of course, Harry Truman visiting Disneyland. He had a great time there. He didn't want to go initially, but Bess talked him into it, and he admitted that he had a great time there. Another Missouri influence on Disneyland, of course, is the Mark Twain steamship, and you can see the Davy Crockett canoes in the foreground here. And a little girl and a little boy from Hannibal, Missouri, in 1956 won a contest to go to Disneyland and to join Walt Disney for the dedication of Tom Sawyer's Island. So this is Pervaloo Miller, who married a doctor here in Columbia, still lives here in Columbia as far as I know, and Chris Winkler back there who portrayed Tom Sawyer. Here's Pervaloo when I interviewed her at her home here in Columbia a few years back. Earl Cox of Mercer, Missouri. There's a whole story behind Earl Cox. His son-in-law helped with the final painting and set decorating of Disneyland. And to give his father-in-law a little surprise, he painted his father-in-law's name, but Earl Cox, Mercer, Missouri, is a real guy. And here's a little mortar and pestle that Walt probably saw when he was a kid in Kansas City, and a similar mortar and pestle at the Upjohn Company's store on Main Street, Disneyland. Here's Ted Cogger with Melba Cogger, his wife, his sister, and another sister, and my good friend Scott Cogger, who was a friend in undergraduate days 50 years ago here at MU, obviously visiting Walt Disney at the Disney studios. Here's Ted in later years, a great guy. Really enjoyed knowing Ted. And there's a little known story, but our book, which again, as Beth said, is available at the bookstore, at the SHSMO bookstore now, talks about and has by far the most detailed account of the plans for a Disneyland park in downtown St. Louis. This is Walt at the Bel Air Hotel in St. Louis announcing that he's going to build a theme park in downtown St. Louis. It would have gone right here where the pavilion, the Marriott Pavilion Hotel is, obviously next to the courthouse and the old Busch Stadium. It's a shame that was never built. It was not the prospect of serving alcohol there, but rather the absence of funding, of financing that caused that park not to be built. Here's Thomas Hart Benton with Walt Disney at the Kansas City Art Institute. Tom Benton said there were three great artists that came out of Missouri. Those were George Caleb Bingham, Walt Disney, and me. And Tom was always a self-promoter, never shy. Here we see Walt Disney, Joyce Hall, Sir Bob Hope, and former President Richard Nixon in Kansas City at the President Hotel at a United Nations event. We're just about out of time here, so I'm going to have to cut to the chase. Walt died on December 15, 1966. He had just turned 65, died from tobacco use. And that's a great shame. If he'd been around for 20 more years, it's exciting to think what might have developed. But there is a nice bust of Walt down at the state capitol building. And I thank you. And we do have, I hope, time for a couple of questions. Beth, are there questions?
We sure do. Yes. And we invite you just to go down to the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A, and Dan will answer those questions. I just was wondering, though, Dan, about the rocket ship that you had restored. Where did that end up at?
Right now, it is
Yeah.
at the Airline History Museum in Kansas City.
Okay.
The Airline History Museum is not open right now. Its centerpiece is the Constellation aircraft that was recently purchased by John Travolta. So John might buy my rocket ship. If not, I may auction it off later this year. You've reminded me, I wanted to be sure to show folks this little artifact I picked up lately. You know, back before the internet, airlines published their schedules on paper. And this is an airline, a TWA airline schedule for July 1955, the very month that Disneyland opened. And of course, it features the Moonliner prominently.
That's very cool. Well, while you're sharing a few artifacts too, I was going to show you one of mine because you talked about Tom Sawyer and some of the ties to Disney. Well, this hangs in my office. It was given to me. I don't know if I can get it in focus here, but it says, "Oh boy, oh boy, am I happy to meet you," to Beth from Uncle Al Gaynor. This was in '72. He was an artist who had worked for Walt Disney, came out of retirement to do the signage and do some of the art department for the Tom Sawyer film musical, directed by Don Taylor, that was filmed in Arrow Rock that year. So we got to know him, and I got an original Walt Disney artist. So it's pretty cool. I've always had it in my home, and now it's here in my office at the State Historical Society. And then I thought, too, I would share this as kind of an interesting tie into the State Historical Society. And it really relates very well with, I don't know if you can see that right now. This was in May 4th, 1945. It was a letter to Floyd Schumacher, who was our executive director. And it goes on a little bit, but he says, "I have one unfulfilled ambition," writes Disney, "which is to buy the farm my father once owned in Marceline. And when the time is right or presents itself, I hope to do this," which we know is now part of the Walt Disney Home and Museum. Kay Mallon's, her father, from Marceline, knew him very well personally, and they have the home, the farmland, so people can go up and visit it. But I thought about what
if I may point out, Mr. Shoemaker was from Lynn County, where Marceline is located, so he had some connections to Walt there. And indeed, Walt did buy the farm, although he sold it back to the Mallons family later on after his passing. The company sold it back.
Right. And we're assuming that he probably, Schumacher had interest and wrote to him, and this is a response letter. But one of the things it does say, and it says, "In Kansas City, which is the crossroads of the United States, I learned what it meant to shift excuse me, yeah, meant to shift for myself, to take advantage of opportunity, and the thing with which every American kid must learn, to take the hard knocks with the good breaks. It sounds like a Missouri, a Missouri kid, doesn't he? So that's in our State Historical Society Missouri collection. So I thought I would just kind of share that too, in talking about it. Looks like we do have a question from one of our attendees. What was Alice's pay as a child in Disney Alice's series?
Well, I wish I could tell you. I don't know. I mean, it certainly wasn't enough for a full-time living. Um, but the short answer is I can't tell you. I don't want to guess. Um, it was, her parents moved to Los Angeles just so she could appear in these short little cartoons, and they, about one a month would come out. So I'm sure she wasn't making very much. But it's great that her parents wanted her to be in the movies. It's great that they were willing to move to Los Angeles just so little Virginia could appear in these one reel silent cartoons. And a lot of those, by the way, are still available, and we'll show them at the Lavergram building when that building is completed. And we don't know when that will be. That's always the question. That, of course, logically enough, people want to know, when's it going to be open. We don't know. It depends on how fast the fundraising goes. But I do want to urge, if you're interested in that project at all, go to thankyouwaltdisney.org. We have a beautiful three-dimensional architectural walkthrough of the building as we hope it will appear when it's completed there. Thankyouwaltdisney.org.
I know you mentioned too, kind of briefed over about President Truman and any ties that he had with him. It sounds like he wasn't like a major fan, maybe, but particularly
Oh, he
Best
was,
tried to get him to go to that one event.
yes.
What more do you know about that? Because both being
I,
from Kansas
I
City, they're
I can tell you that in her autobiography, Margaret Truman wrote about that incident. She was not present, but she wrote based on what her parents told her. And so Harry and Bess and a man named Murphy, who was an aide to the former president, were all in Los Angeles for, I believe, a Democratic Party meeting of some kind. This was in 1957, so Disneyland had been open for just 2 years. And in their room, Bess Truman announces that she would like to go to Disneyland. And Harry responded that he had no interest whatsoever in going to Disneyland. He was not going to be going to Disneyland. And Bess says, "Well, that's okay, Harry. I'm sure Mr. Murphy will take me, won't you?" And of course, Mr. Murphy said, "Yes, ma'am, I will take you to Disneyland." Well, the next morning, Mr. Murphy shows up at their hotel room and knocks on the door, and Harry answers the door, and Harry's got his cane and his hat and looks like he's ready to go somewhere. And Murphy says, "Well, Mr. President, where are you going today?" And through gritted teeth, Harry says, "I'm going to Disneyland." And so the three of them made the trip. Now, what's interesting is that, Disneyland could not have had much advance notice of that, but they did put together some special recognition for the former president there. Security wasn't as great a concern back then as it became later on. And so Harry, Bess, and Mr. Murphy went to the park. And according to the LA Times, Harry went on every ride in the park except for one. He said because of the possible association with the Republican Party symbol, he refused to be photographed on Dumbo. And so every other ride, he had a great time there. He declared it was a great educational experience.
those are such great stories. You,
Mhm.
you know, Dan, I know you've been a mega fan and a historian for so long on this. What really led you down that rabbit hole to want to learn more about Disney? Or first of all, what sparked your interest, and then what allowed you to kind of continue on?
Well, we all grow up with Disney, of course. Everyone who's alive on the planet today has grown up with Disney in some sense or another. But my real serious interest in researching grew out of an interest in Missouri history, of course, and an interest in film history. And we do have a lot of film history here in Missouri, people from Missouri who made a major impact in film. And among those is Joan Crawford, certainly an actress who I think is underappreciated today, underrated. She was not Mommy Dearest. She was a brilliant and very hardworking actress. By the way, she spent one semester at Stevens College here in Columbia. And Steve McQueen, is another Missourian who made a major impact. He was the most successful actor in the world during the decade of the 1960s. Died all too young from mesothelioma, but Steve McQueen also made a major impact on the film industry. So my interest simply grew out of the confluence of those two interests, film history and Missouri history. Walt Disney, by far, as Leonard Maltin said, was the most successful and the most influential filmmaker in the history of the movies, not just animated movies, all movies. And that becomes more true every day as the Walt Disney Company expands, as the Walt Disney Company acquires ABC television, acquired the Muppets, acquired Star Wars, acquired Indiana Jones, acquired the Marvel characters. As that building has gone on growing, I'm more and more convinced if Walt were with us today, he would be very, very happy that his company still continues to thrive.
Absolutely. And one of our attendees just mentioned when we were talking about Truman, when he left, when we returned to Independence, he did not have any Secret Service protection. And Independence Police Department provided a single officer to him. So until JFK's assassination, when full protection was then given to the president. So it's not surprising that Truman had no protection at Disneyland. So yeah, we don't think of that today ever happening, but it was a
Sure.
different back then.
You know,
Even my
you know,
mother, who's watching, she's watching from
uh,
Washington, Missouri,
uh,
and she rode an elevator at the Mulebach Hotel
uh,
with Truman. So
that's
not Walt
great.
Disney, with Truman, but he
You
had
know,
no protection with him. And this was
when,
after
when
he,
When Nikita Khrushchev visited the United States in the early 1960s, one of his highest priorities was to go to Disneyland. And the Secret Service said, no, we cannot provide you with the protection you would need. They would not allow Khrushchev to go to Disneyland, and he pitched a fit. He was angry and very disappointed that he could not go to Disneyland. And so they had become more security conscious. I think that may have been that. Well, I'm not sure if that was before or after the Kennedy assassinations, but they certainly were more security conscious by that time.
absolutely. Well, Dan, I know we are about out of time right now. We thank you so much for joining us and for our audience today and for your questions. Especially, Dan, you've been so dedicated to sharing the stories and history of Disney's formative years here in Missouri. And so we so appreciate all the work you have done to kind of preserve that history and share it with all of us. Now, your book is out of print from what, 20 years ago or so, I think, when you wrote it.
Yeah, yeah, it was,
But
only 5,000 copies of this book printed, so it was almost a
yes,
limited run to begin with. And you can occasionally find it online, but I have some copies for sale. And as we said earlier, there are some copies for sale right now at the SHSMO bookstore. So I urge people to check it out there. Uh, it is
abs
it is the most detailed account of Walt's 15 years living in Missouri.
Absolutely. And also at the same time, I just wanted to let people know in case you have, I don't know if you can see my screen right now, it's our main website, but in case you missed part one, you want to watch Dan's program, which I'll have uploaded and kind of slightly edited and uploaded by early April. You go up here to the Learn tab, you get a drop down menu, you go all the way to Videos on Demand. Okay. And that's where you will find it, along with all of our other programming that we've recorded in the past. So if you're looking something to do on a rainy day, or if we get one of those winter days that come upon us before spring is finally here, you can certainly check all that out there as well. So, but again, thank you all for joining us. At the same time, we do invite you to come to Columbia, visit our bookstore. Also, now until through the end of June, actually, is Daily Disney, Walt Disney cartoons, and the funny pages on display in the State Historical Society Art Gallery through the month of June. So now through June, its exhibit is featuring our collection of Disney cartoons in the syndicated newspapers. So it's a lot of fun to check that out as well. So if you're in Columbia, it's at our headquarters building at 605 Elm Street. Come by and check that out. And again, thank you all for being here. Dan, great to see you again. And we will see you all next time.
Thank you, Beth.